I'm 58 years old now, and for 23 years, I've kept silent about what we found in the waters off the Great Barrier Reef in 2002. My name is Dr. Marcus Reed. I was a marine biologist specializing in shark behavior and migration patterns. I still am, technically, though I haven't been back to those waters since April of that year. The Australian Maritime Safety Authority brought me in to investigate unusual marine activity after 14 experienced divers vanished from a 40-mile stretch of reef near Cairns. All of them disappeared during night dives. None of them sent distress signals. All of their equipment functioned perfectly when recovered. We caught something on April 7, 2002 at 2:47 in the morning. Something that wasn't supposed to exist. She was tangled in our shark bait lines, bleeding from the hooks we'd set to study great white feeding behavior. When she looked up at us from the nets, I heard her make a sound that my brain tried to translate as a word, and 3 days later, before I released her back into the ocean and destroyed every piece of evidence we'd collected, she told me what happened to those divers. Not all of it was murder, but enough of it was. I need to tell this exactly as it happened because I've carried the weight of those deaths for more than 2 decades. 14 families never got real answers. The official investigation concluded misadventure and marine hazard, nature unspecified. I wrote that final report. I filed the paperwork that closed those cases, and I've lived with that decision every day since, knowing that the truth would have sparked something far worse than grief. This is what really happened in those waters. This is why we stopped searching. The first diver vanished on January 9, 2002. His name was Colin Ashworth, 34, a dive instructor from Brisbane with over 800 log dives. He'd been leading a night charter near Flynn Reef, about 35 nautical miles offshore. The group descended at 8:15 p.m. for a planned 45-minute dive to observe feeding behavior in nocturnal reef species. At 8:33 p.m., his dive partner reported that Colin had signaled he was going to photograph a moray eel den approximately 20 meters from the main group. He never returned to the boat. Search and rescue found his tank the next morning, still half full, resting on the reef floor at 62 feet. His regulator was in his mouth. His mask was on his face. His weight belt was properly secured. There was no sign of struggle, no equipment malfunction, no indication of panic or rapid ascent. The underwater camera he'd been carrying was gone. 3 weeks later, on January 31st, 2 divers disappeared from separate locations within the same night. Sarah Chen, 29, vanished during a solo night dive near Opal Reef. Her body was never recovered, but her dive computer was found wedged in a coral formation, showing a maximum depth of 89 feet and a dive time of 16 minutes when it stopped recording. Marcus Webb, 41, disappeared from a group dive at Norman Reef. His tank, fins, and mask were discovered scattered across a 50-meter radius, but again, no body. The Australian Maritime Safety Authority issued a precautionary notice on February 4th. They suggested avoiding night dives in the affected area until the cause could be determined. Most operators complied, some didn't. Tourism revenue in Cairns depends heavily on diving operations, and the reef is enormous. The idea that something was systematically targeting divers seemed impossible. By the end of February, 7 more divers had vanished, all during night dives, all in that same 40-mile corridor of reef between Flynn and Norman. The pattern was too specific to ignore and too scattered to predict. Depths ranged from 45 to 110 feet. Experience levels varied from novice to professional. Ages ranged from 22 to 56. There was no common equipment brand, no shared dive operator, no weather pattern that linked the incidents. What they did share was timing. Every disappearance occurred between 8 p.m. and 4 a.m. Every single one happened during the new moon phase or within 3 days of it when the ocean was darkest. I arrived in Cairns on March 18th. The AMSA had contracted me through James Cook University, where I'd been researching great white shark predation patterns for the previous 8 years. They wanted someone who understood apex predator behavior and could determine whether an animal was responsible. Tiger sharks, bull sharks, and great whites all frequented the area. The assumption was that an unusually aggressive individual had claimed territory and was attacking divers who entered it at night. I spent 4 days reviewing incident reports, interviewing survivors from dive groups where someone had vanished, and examining recovered equipment. Nothing supported the shark hypothesis. Shark attacks leave evidence: tooth marks on tanks, torn wetsuits, blood in the water, bite patterns on recovered bodies. We had none of that. What we had were clean disappearances, as if the divers had simply been removed from the reef with surgical precision. On March 22nd, I went down myself. A night dive at Flynn Reef, right in the center of the disappearance zone. I took 2 safety divers with me, both former Navy clearance divers with combat experience. We carried underwater lights powerful enough to illuminate 30 meters in any direction. We descended at 9:45 p.m., the same time frame when Colin Ashworth had vanished. The reef was quiet. Too quiet. I'd dived hundreds of reefs at night, and there's always movement, always sound conducted through the water. Fish emerging from daytime hiding spots, octopuses hunting, eels patrolling their territories. That night the reef felt empty. My light cut through the water and found nothing but coral and rock. No fish, no movement. The only sound was our breathing and the mechanical click of our regulators. At 10:12 p.m., I heard something else. A vocalization, low frequency, traveling through the water from somewhere beyond our lights. Not mechanical, not whale song or dolphin clicks, which I knew well. Something between a hum and a word, rising and falling in pitch with a pattern that felt intentional. My safety divers heard it too. I could see them turning, trying to locate the source. The sound repeated 3 times, each slightly different, like someone testing variations of a phrase. Then it stopped. We waited for 5 minutes in silence, then surfaced. Back on the boat, neither of my safety divers would admit what they'd heard. They both claimed it was probably a whale in the distance, even though humpback migration season had ended 2 months earlier. I didn't push it. I'd seen their faces when that sound came through the water. They'd heard the same thing I had, something trying to communicate. By the end of March, the total disappearances reached 14. The AMSA suspended all night diving operations in the affected area indefinitely. The tourism industry was in chaos. Cairns depends on reef access, and closing 40 miles of it meant millions in lost revenue. Pressure mounted for answers, for resolution, for anything that would let them reopen the sites. That's when I proposed the research expedition. If something was in those waters, something territorial and aggressive enough to be removing divers, then I needed to observe it directly, not with a quick dive and bright lights that would scare off anything with sense. I needed to draw it out, to study it the way I'd study any apex predator, with bait, cameras, and patience. The AMSA approved my proposal on March 29th. They gave me 2 weeks, a research vessel, and authorization to use whatever methods I deemed scientifically necessary. They wanted answers. They wanted something they could report to the families, something they could use to explain why 14 people had vanished without a trace. I should have refused. I should have told them that some questions don't have answers we're prepared to accept. But I was 35 years old, ambitious, and convinced that science could explain anything if you observed it long enough. I was wrong. The Coral Star was a 48-foot research vessel owned by the university, equipped with wet labs, holding tanks, and accommodation for 6 people. We loaded her with equipment on April 1st, underwater camera arrays, sonar systems, shark bait stations, sample collection gear, and enough supplies for 2 weeks at sea. The plan was to anchor at 3 different sites within the disappearance zone, deploy bait lines at dusk, and monitor what came to feed overnight. My crew consisted of 5 people. Dr. Sarah Chen was a postdoctoral researcher in marine ecology from the university. She'd specialized in reef ecosystems and nighttime predator behavior. Tom Bradshaw was my graduate student, 26 years old. The Coral Star was a 48-foot research vessel owned by the university, equipped with wet labs, holding tanks, and accommodation for 6 people. We loaded her with equipment on April 1st, underwater camera arrays, sonar systems, shark bait stations, sample collection gear, and enough supplies for 2 weeks at sea. The plan was to anchor at 3 different sites within the disappearance zone, deploy bait lines at dusk, and monitor what came to feed overnight. My crew consisted of 5 people. Dr. Sarah Chen was a postdoctoral researcher in marine ecology from the university. She'd specialized in reef ecosystems and nighttime predator behavior. Tom Bradshaw was my graduate student, 26 years old, working on his thesis about shark sensory systems. The documentary filmmaker was Nina Kowalski, hired by the IMSA to record whatever we found. They wanted footage for the families, for the media, for proof that they'd done everything possible to investigate. Our 2 dive masters were brothers, James and Robert Yui, both indigenous Australians from the Gimui Walubara Yidinji people, who'd lived along this coast for thousands of years. They'd worked as commercial dive instructors for 15 years and knew these reefs better than anyone. I'd specifically requested indigenous guides because I wanted local knowledge, traditional understanding of the waters that might not appear in scientific literature. During our first planning meeting on the boat, Robert asked me a question I should have paid more attention to. "You ever heard of Yok-Yok?" he said. I shook my head. Sarah looked up from her equipment checklist, interested. "There are spirits in the water," Robert continued. "Our grandmothers told stories about them. Women who live in water holes and deep ocean. They're guardians. They protect sacred places. You don't go into their territory without permission, and you definitely don't hunt there." "You think that's what's taking the divers?" Tom asked. He said it with the kind of skeptical politeness that academics use when discussing folklore. "I think there's parts of the reef that have always been closed," James said. His voice was quieter than his brother's, more careful. "Not closed by law, closed by respect. People used to know which places you didn't fish, didn't swim, didn't hunt. Maybe we forgot. Maybe that's the problem." I told them I'd keep an open mind, but that we needed empirical data, observable phenomena, something we could measure and document. Robert nodded but didn't look convinced. Looking back, I realized he was trying to warn us in the only way he could without sounding like he believed in myths. He knew something was in those waters. He knew his grandmother's stories existed for a reason. We departed Cairns Harbor at 6 a.m. on April 2nd and reached our first anchor point by 9:30 a.m., Flynn Reef, the site where Colin Ashworth had vanished. The water was clear that morning, visibility extending down past 100 feet. Sarah and I did a survey dive at noon to familiarize ourselves with the bottom topography and identify good locations for camera placement. The reef looked healthy. Dense coral formations, abundant fish populations, the normal ecosystem activity you'd expect. Nothing seemed wrong, nothing felt dangerous. We placed 4 cameras at different points around the site, each with infrared capability for night recording. Back on the boat, Nina set up the monitoring station where we could watch all 4 feeds simultaneously. At 4 p.m., we began preparing the bait. I'd brought frozen tuna and mackerel, standard shark attractants. We attached the bait to heavy lines with steel leaders and deployed them at 3 locations around our anchor point, each descending to about 60 feet. The hooks were large, designed for catching great whites. Whatever came to feed would be substantial. By 6 p.m., the sun was setting. The water darkened from blue to black. We'd agreed on a watch rotation. Sarah and I would take the first shift from 6 p.m. to midnight, monitoring the camera feeds. Tom and Nina would take midnight to 6 a.m. James and Robert would rotate in as needed, and both would be available if we needed to investigate anything we saw on the cameras. Nothing happened for the first 3 hours. The cameras showed occasional reef sharks, A few smaller fish investigating the bait. Normal activity. Sarah and I drank coffee and discussed what we were really expecting to find. She thought it might be a large tiger shark, possibly injured or sick, behaving atypically. I was less certain. The pattern of disappearances felt too deliberate, too selective. At 9:47 p.m., the bait line on camera 3 went taut. The line was rated for 800 pounds of pull. It stretched nearly horizontal, pointing down into the darkness beyond the camera's infrared range. Whatever had taken the bait was strong and moving away from the reef. I called Tom and Nina up from their bunks. All 5 of us gathered around the monitors, watching the line strain. On camera 4, positioned 40 meters away, we could see the water churning where something large was thrashing below the visible depth. The movement was violent but controlled, not the chaotic frenzy of a hooked shark. It felt more like something trying to pull free, while also testing the strength of what held it. "Should we bring it up?" Tom asked. I hesitated. Standard protocol would be to haul in the line, see what we'd caught, tag it if it was a shark, release it, and continue monitoring. But something about the movement patterns made me cautious. The pulling came in rhythmic intervals, testing rather than panicking. "Let's wait," I said. "Let it tire itself out. I want to see how it behaves." For 20 minutes, we watched the line strain and relax, strain and relax. The force nearly capsized us. The entire boat lurched to starboard as the bait line on camera 2 went rigid. Tom fell against the bulkhead. Nina's camera equipment slid across the deck. I grabbed the rail and looked over the side, where the line cut into the water at a 60-degree angle, vibrating with tension. "It's going to snap the cleat," James shouted. He was already moving toward the winch controls, but Robert caught his arm. "Don't bring it up," Robert said. His voice was urgent. "Marcus, don't bring it up." I was already at the winch. Every instinct I had as a marine biologist said to retrieve whatever was on that line. This was what we'd come here for. This was the answer to 14 disappearances. I activated the motor. The winch groaned. The line rose inch by inch, the motor straining against whatever was pulling back. At 3:02 a.m., we saw the net breaking the surface. We'd attached a mesh bag below the hook to capture anything we caught, and something was tangled in it. Something pale gray, thrashing in the underwater lights Nina had aimed over the rail. "Stop the winch," Sarah said. Her voice was flat, shocked. "Marcus, stop." I'd already stopped. We were all staring at what we'd pulled from the water. She was roughly the size of a human adult, maybe 5.5 feet long. Her skin was smooth, gray, with a faint sheen that reflected our lights like mother of pearl. The body structure was humanoid. 2 arms, a torso, a head, but the proportions were wrong. The arms were longer, the hands were webbed. The torso tapered into what might have been legs or might have been a tail, impossible to tell with everything tangled in the netting. Her face was the worst part, almost human. High cheekbones, a defined nose, a mouth that could have passed for human, except for the width, the way it opened too far at the corners. She was bleeding. The hooks had caught her in the shoulder and along her left side. The wounds leaked dark fluid that mixed with seawater and dripped back into the ocean. She wasn't thrashing anymore. She was watching us. Her eyes were black, completely black, no visible iris or pupil, and they moved from face to face with obvious intelligence. Tom leaned over the rail and vomited. "Jesus Christ," Nina whispered. She had her camera up, filming. Her hands were shaking so badly the footage must have been unusable. "Get a tarp," I said. My voice sounded distant, not my own. "Cover her. We need to get her into the holding tank." "No," Robert said. "We need to cut her loose, right now. Cut the net and let her go." "Are you insane?" Sarah was staring at the creature with the expression of someone watching their entire understanding of biology rewrite itself. "This is a living cryptid. This is proof of a species science doesn't even have a classification for. We can't just..." The creature made a sound, not a scream, not a cry. A vocalization that had structure, rhythm, intention. It came from her throat but resonated at a frequency, That made my teeth ache. The sound rose and fell 3 times, each repetition slightly different, and I realized, with a shock that felt like cold water in my veins, that I'd heard this before. This was the sound from my dive at Flynn Reef. This was what I'd heard while standing on the bottom with my safety divers. She was calling for something in the water below us. "Get her in the tank now," I said. "James, help me lift the net." Robert stepped back, shaking his head. "You're making a mistake. You're all making a mistake." But James helped me. We lifted the net, the creature still tangled inside, bleeding and watching us with those black eyes, and we carried her across the deck to the research tank. It was a circular pool, 12 feet in diameter, filled with recirculated seawater. We used it for temporarily holding specimens during tagging research. We lowered the net into the water and carefully cut it away from her body. The hooks were embedded deep. I used surgical pliers to extract them while Sarah held her still. The creature didn't fight. She watched my hands work, and when I pulled the second hook from her shoulder, she made a sound that was unmistakably pain. Not animal pain, conscious, aware pain that expected empathy. "I'm sorry," I said. I don't know why I said it. "I'm sorry, we're going to help you." Once the hooks were out, we retreated from the tank. The creature sank to the bottom and curled there, her webbed hands pressed against the wounds. Sarah was already preparing antibiotics, antiseptics, anything we could use to prevent infection. Nina filmed everything. Tom stood at the rail staring down into the ocean, not speaking. Robert had gone below deck. James stood with his arms crossed, watching the tank with an expression I couldn't read. "We need to call this in," Sarah said. "The university, AMSA. Someone needs to know what we have." "In the morning," I said. "Let's stabilize her first. Let's make sure she survives." At 4:15 a.m. she surfaced. Her head broke the water, and she looked directly at me. Then she opened her mouth and repeated the last words I'd spoken, in my exact voice. "I'm sorry." None of us slept after that. We stood around the tank as the sun came up, watching her watch us. She remained at the bottom for most of the morning, occasionally surfacing to breathe. None of us slept after that. We stood around the tank as the sun came up, watching her watch us. She remained at the bottom for most of the morning, occasionally surfacing to breathe. Her respiratory system appeared to be amphibious, capable of extracting oxygen from both air and water, though she seemed to prefer staying submerged. The wounds had stopped bleeding, but I couldn't tell if that was natural clotting or if we should be more concerned. At 7:30 a.m., Sarah tried to feed her. She'd prepared a mixture of raw fish and squid, the standard diet we used for captive sharks. The creature ignored it. Sarah left the food floating in the tank and stepped back. For 20 minutes, nothing happened. Then the creature rose, examined the food with her hands rather than her mouth, and pushed it to the edge of the tank nearest to where Sarah stood. "She's refusing it," Tom said. "Or returning it," James said quietly. "Like you're refusing her." I understood what he meant. The gesture had been deliberate, conscious. This wasn't an animal rejecting unfamiliar food. This was communication, a refusal, possibly even an insult. At 9 a.m., I decided we needed to establish some form of dialogue. I pulled a chair to the edge of the tank and sat where she could see me clearly. She was at the bottom, curled in the same position, but her eyes tracked my movement. I raised my hand slowly and waved. A simple, universal gesture of greeting. She didn't respond. I tried again, still nothing. Then I lowered my hand and simply sat, watching her watch me. After 5 minutes, she uncurled slightly. After 10 minutes, she rose to the middle depth of the tank, suspended in the water, still watching. I pointed to myself. "Marcus," I said clearly. Then I pointed to her and raised my eyebrows in question. She tilted her head. The movement was eerily human. Then she opened her mouth and repeated my voice exactly. "Marcus, Sarah had joined me at the tank's edge. She's mimicking you, like a parrot." "Parrots don't mimic context," I said. I pointed to myself again. Marcus? Then I pointed to Sarah. Sarah. I pointed to the creature, waited. She rose further, her head breaking the surface. Water ran from her face. She looked at Sarah, then at me. When she spoke, she used both our voices, layered somehow. Marcus, Sarah. Then she pointed at herself with one webbed hand. The gesture was so human, so unmistakably intentional, that I felt something in my chest tighten. She understood pointing. She understood the exchange. She was trying to tell us something, but she didn't have a word for herself that we could comprehend. "We need a name," Tom said. He'd been standing behind us, filming with Nina's camera. "We can't keep calling her the creature." "She probably has a name," James said, "in whatever language her people use." Her people. The phrase hung in the air. If she existed, there were more. There had to be more. And if there were more, then what we'd caught wasn't just a biological specimen. It was a person, a thinking, feeling individual from a population we'd never known existed. I spent the rest of that morning trying to establish basic communication. I used simple words and gestures, repeating them until she started mimicking them back. Yes, no, food, water, pain, help. She learned quickly, too quickly for random mimicry. By noon, she could respond to yes or no questions with reasonable accuracy, nodding or shaking her head in the same way humans do. "Are you in pain?" Head shake. "No." "Are you hungry?" Long pause, then a nod. "Yes." "Do you understand me?" Another pause, longer. Then she spoke in my voice softly. "Understand." At 1 p.m. I tried something different. I brought photographs. We'd been given files on all 14 missing divers, part of the investigation materials. I held up the first photo, Colin Ashworth, and showed it to her. Her reaction was immediate. She retreated to the far side of the tank, sinking to the bottom. She made that sound again, the low vocalization that resonated in my chest. But this time it was different. Rhythmic, repetitive, rising and falling like a chant or a song. It lasted for nearly a minute. "What is she doing?" Nina asked. She was recording everything, her camera trained on the tank. "I think she's grieving," Sarah said. I showed her the next photo. Marcus Webb. Same reaction. Retreat, that sound, that terrible, rhythmic grieving. I went through all 14 photos. Every single one produced the same response. By the time I finished, the creature had curled at the bottom of the tank, her arms wrapped around herself, making that sound continuously. I'd confirmed what I'd suspected. She knew about the missing divers. She knew what had happened to them. At 3 p.m., I tried to ask her directly. I sat at the edge of the tank with the photograph spread in front of me. She was still at the bottom, quiet now, watching. I pointed to the photos, then gestured around us at the ocean. "Where are they?" Then she raised one webbed hand and pointed down. Down into the water below our boat, down into the depths of the reef. "They're down there?" I asked. "Below us?" She nodded. Then she did something I didn't expect. She pressed her palm against the glass side of the tank and hummed. Not the grieving sound, something else. A single sustained note that made the water in the tank vibrate. I felt it through the deck beneath my feet. She held the note for 10 seconds, then stopped and looked at me expectantly. I didn't understand. I shook my head, frustrated. She tried again, pressing both hands to the glass, humming that same note, but varying the pitch, up and down in a pattern. She was trying to show me something, trying to communicate something more complex than yes or no. On impulse, I pressed my palm against the glass where her hand was. The moment our hands connected with only the tank wall between them, something changed. The humming intensified, but it wasn't just sound anymore. It was in my head. Images, sensations, emotions that weren't mine. I saw darkness, deep water, caves in the reef. I felt territorial anger, protective rage. I saw lights descending, human shapes with tanks and cameras entering spaces that were marked, claimed, sacred. I saw her people defending their territory the only way they knew how. I jerked my hand back, gasping. The connection broke immediately. The creature lowered her hands and sank back to the bottom of the tank, watching me with what might have been satisfaction or might have been resignation. What happened? Sarah was at my side, concerned. Marcus, what just happened? She showed me, I said. My voice was shaking. She can communicate telepathically through touch. She showed me what happened to the divers. What did you see? I looked at the photographs spread across the deck. 14 faces, 14 people who'd descended into the wrong waters at the wrong time. We need to let her go, I said. Right now. We need to open the drains and let her go. Absolutely not, Sarah said. Marcus, this is the most important biological discovery in a century. We can't just... They weren't accidents, I interrupted. The disappearances. They were territorial disputes. Her people have been living in those reefs for generations, and we've been pushing deeper into their territory with every dive, every boat, every fucking underwater tourist attraction. They tried to warn us. They tried to mark their boundaries. We didn't understand, so they started removing the divers who got too close. Removing them how? Tom asked quietly. I looked at the creature in the tank. She looked back at me, waiting. That's what I need to ask her, I said, but I don't think I want to know the answer. I returned to the tank at dusk. The others had gone below to review Nina's footage and debate what we should do next. Sarah wanted to contact the university immediately. Tom was drafting a paper in his head, already imagining the career-defining publication. Nina had enough footage to change marine biology forever. Only James and Robert had stayed silent, watching me with expressions that said they'd expected this all along. I sat at the edge of the tank with a notebook and pen. The creature rose to meet me, her black eyes reflecting the last light of sunset. I pressed my palm to the glass. She hesitated, then pressed hers to match. The connection opened like a door in my mind. This time, I was ready for it. The images came slower, more controlled. She was learning to communicate with me, adjusting the flow of information so I wouldn't pull away again. I saw her people, dozens of them, maybe more, living in the deeper caves and trenches of the reef. They were a community, families, with structure and hierarchy I couldn't fully grasp. They'd been there for generations, long before dive tourism, long before modern boats. They had territories, breeding grounds in certain caves where their young were vulnerable, feeding areas they'd claimed and defended, sacred spaces where they mourned their dead, places marked with arrangements of shells and coral that I'd probably seen and dismissed as natural formations. She showed me humans descending with lights and cameras, pushing into the breeding caves during mating season. She showed me boats anchoring directly above their resting places, propellers churning the water at depths where her people tried to sleep. She showed me divers with spear guns hunting fish in their feeding grounds, taking prey they needed to survive. Her people had tried to warn us. They'd moved equipment, stolen cameras, created sounds in the water to drive divers away. We'd interpreted these as mysteries, strange occurrences, maybe pranks. We'd never considered they were messages. When the warnings failed, they took more direct action. She showed me Colin Ashworth photographing a moray eel den that wasn't a den at all, but an entrance to a nursery cave. She showed 3 of her people emerging from the darkness surrounding him. His light went out. Not broken, extinguished. They could do that somehow, disrupt electrical systems with that same humming frequency I'd felt through the tank. In the darkness, they'd taken him, pulled him down into the caves where humans couldn't follow without specialized equipment. She didn't show me what happened next. The images stopped there, replaced by a feeling of grim necessity, of choices made to protect vulnerable young. Not all 14 divers had died for the same reason. Some had been warnings that escalated. Some had been defending territory during crucial seasons. 2 had been accidents, cases of mistaken threat assessment where her people had reacted with lethal force to perceived aggression, only to realize too late that the divers were harmless. She felt guilt about those 2, I could sense it in the emotional undertone of the images. Her people weren't monsters. They were intelligent beings trying to survive in an environment we were slowly colonizing without ever asking permission or understanding what we were displacing. I pulled my hand back. The connection broke. I sat there breathing hard, my notebook forgotten on my lap. "Why didn't you just leave?" I asked aloud. "Why not move to deeper water, somewhere humans don't go?" She couldn't answer with words, so I pressed my palm to the glass again. She showed me the reef, the specific caves and formations her people depended on. These weren't just territories, they were home. The caves provided specific temperature ranges for their eggs. The coral formations created current patterns that concentrated the prey they needed. The reef structure protected them from larger predators that hunted in open water. Moving would mean abandoning generations of knowledge, specific adaptations to this environment. It would mean exposing their young to new dangers, potentially losing entire bloodlines. They couldn't just leave any more than a human village could abandon their farmland and survive in the Arctic. She showed me something else. More humans coming. Every year, more boats, more divers, more lights pushing deeper. Her people were running out of space to retreat to. They were running out of options that didn't involve increasingly violent defense of their shrinking territory. And then she showed me what was gathering in the water below our boat. At least 40 of her kind, waiting in the darkness beneath the coral star. They'd been there since we caught her, watching, listening, waiting to see what we would do with their captured family member. I felt their collective anger, their fear, their debate about whether to attack the boat or wait. Some wanted to sink us immediately. Others argued for patience, for seeing if we could be reasoned with. She'd been arguing on our behalf, telling them through whatever means they used to communicate across distances that I'd tried to help her, that I'd removed the hooks, that some humans might be different. But patience was wearing thin. If we didn't release her soon, if we tried to take her to land, to a facility, to any place where more humans could study her, the waiting group would act. They'd sink the boat. They'd pull us down into the caves, and they'd make sure no one ever found our bodies or the research vessel or any evidence of what we'd discovered. I pulled my hand away and looked at her. "How long do I have?" She raised her webbed hand and extended 3 fingers. 3 days. In 3 days, if she wasn't free, they'd kill all of us. I called a meeting at 8 p.m. in the main cabin. All 6 of us crowded around the small table where we usually ate meals. Nina had her camera off for once, sensing this needed to be private. I told them everything I'd learned through the telepathic connection. I described her people, their territories, their reasons for the attacks. I explained about the 40 waiting in the water below us. Sarah listened with her arms crossed, her expression cycling between fascination and frustration. "So, you're saying these creatures have been systematically killing divers to protect their territory?" "Defending," James corrected quietly. "There's a difference." 14 people are dead, Sarah said. "I'm not sure the semantics matter to their families." "And how many of her people have died from boat propellers, fishing nets, pollution?" Robert asked. "We don't count those bodies." "This is different," Tom said. "These are intelligent beings. They can communicate. They understand consequences. That makes them responsible for their choices." "Does it?" I asked. "If someone broke into your home, your nursery, and you defended your children, would you be responsible or justified?" The debate went in circles for an hour. Sarah argued for contacting the authorities, bringing in specialists, creating a framework for peaceful coexistence. Tom worried about the implications for all dive tourism in the area. Nina stayed quiet, but I could see her mind working, probably calculating the value of the story she was sitting on. Robert finally spoke up. "My grandmother told me stories about Yak-Yak when I was young. She said they used to have agreements with our people. We knew where not to fish, where not to swim. They knew we respected their spaces. Then the Europeans came with their boats and their rules. and nobody listened to the old agreements anymore. The Yok-Yok got pushed back further and further until there was nowhere left to push. "You're saying this is colonialism," Sarah said. "You're comparing marine territorial defense to land displacement." "I'm saying it's the same pattern," Robert replied. "Take someone's home, ignore their warnings, act surprised when they fight back, then call them savages for defending what's theirs." I looked at the creature through the cabin window. She was visible in the tank on deck, floating motionless, watching the stars. "The question isn't whether they're justified," I said. "The question is what we do now. We have 3 days before the group below us attacks. We can release her and walk away, or we can try to document this and probably die in the process." "There's a third option," Sarah said. "We release her, and then we report what we've found. We work with authorities to establish protected zones, no-dive areas, a framework that respects their territory while allowing safe human access to other parts of the reef." "You think the government will create protected zones based on our testimony?" Tom asked. "Based on us claiming we telepathically communicated with a mermaid? They'll think we lost our minds from isolation." He was right. Without physical evidence, without the creature herself, we had nothing but an incredible story. And incredible stories don't change policy or protect endangered species, especially species that had killed 14 people. "We have Nina's footage," I said. Nina shook her head. "I reviewed it this morning. The lighting was terrible during the capture. You can see something in the net, something vaguely humanoid, but it's not clear enough to prove anything. It looks like it could be a large fish or a person in a costume. The footage of her in the tank is better, but still ambiguous. Anyone could claim we hoaxed it." "So we have nothing," Sarah said bitterly. "We make the most important zoological discovery in history, and we have nothing we can take back." I stood up and walked to the window. The creature had turned in the tank and was looking at me. Even from a distance, I could feel her watching, waiting for me to make a choice. "We have something better than proof," I said. "We have a chance to not make things worse." I turned back to the group. "Think about what happens if we do report this. If we somehow convince authorities that an intelligent species is living in these reefs. What comes next? Research vessels, military involvement, capture teams trying to bring in specimens, people trying to establish contact, establish territory, establish control. We'd be starting a war between species, and her people are already losing ground. They're already desperate enough to kill to protect what little territory they have left." "So we just let 14 murders go unanswered?" Tom asked. "They weren't murders," James said. "They were territorial defense. And the only reason they happened is because we kept pushing into spaces we'd been warned to avoid. We just didn't recognize the warnings." I made my decision then. "We release her tomorrow at dawn. We document in our official report that we found evidence of a large predator, possibly a new species of shark or ray, exhibiting territorial behavior. We recommend the affected area be closed to night diving indefinitely, with no justification beyond precautionary principles. Then we come home and we never speak about what we really found." "You want us to lie," Sarah said. "I want us to protect a species we nearly destroyed by being exactly what we always are, intrusive, exploitative, and convinced that our right to explore outweighs everything else." I looked at each of them. "If you can't agree to that, if you need to tell the truth, I understand. But know that telling the truth means more boats, more interference, and probably the extinction of her entire people within a generation." The silence lasted a long time. Finally, Sarah nodded. Then, Tom. Nina turned her camera on and filmed herself deleting the tank footage, making it part of the official record that she'd chosen to destroy, the evidence. Only Robert spoke. "This is the right choice," he said. "It's about 50 years too late, but it's right." I went up on deck and sat by the tank. The creature rose to meet me. I pressed my palm to the glass and felt her relief, her gratitude, her lingering fear that I might change my mind. I showed her my intention: release at dawn, safety, freedom to return to her people. She showed me something in return, A memory of the reef before boats, before divers, before the water filled with engine noise and artificial light. A memory of peace. Then she showed me one more thing, the divers' bodies preserved in a deep cave system, her people's way of respecting the dead, keeping them safe, rather than leaving them to scavengers. The families could never know, could never have closure, but at least their lost ones weren't alone in the dark. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on deck watching the tank, watching the stars, thinking about the choice I'd made. Around midnight, Sarah joined me. She brought 2 cups of coffee and sat without speaking for a while. "I understand why you're doing this," she finally said. "I don't like it, but I understand." "We're going to file a report that closes 40 miles of reef to night diving," I said. "That's something. That gives them space." "For how long?" Sarah asked. 10 years? 20? Eventually, someone's going to push for reopening. Tourism money always wins. And when they do, this starts again. She was right, but I didn't have a better answer. We couldn't protect the reef forever. We couldn't stop human expansion. All we could do was buy time and hope that somehow her people would find a way to survive what we'd brought to their world. At 4 a.m., I began preparing for release. I tested the water quality in the tank, checked the creature's wounds, made sure she was strong enough to travel. The injuries had healed remarkably fast. Her physiology apparently adapted for rapid recovery. She watched me work with patient attention, occasionally making soft sounds that might have been approval or gratitude. The sun rose at 5:47 a.m. I'd positioned the boat at the edge of the deepest trench in the area, where her people could easily reach her. James helped me rig a sling to lift her from the tank without causing additional injury. She remained calm throughout, trusting us completely, or perhaps simply resigned to whatever we chose to do. At 6:15 a.m., with all 6 of us on deck, we lifted her from the tank. She was heavier than she looked, dense muscle and bone adapted for deep water pressure. We carried her to the rail and lowered her into the sling that would take her down below the surface. Before we released the sling, I pressed my hand to her arm one final time. The connection opened. She showed me gratitude, not just from her, but from all of them waiting below. She showed me hope, that maybe some humans could learn, could change, could coexist. Then she showed me a warning. Others of my kind would come, others who wouldn't listen, who wouldn't stop. When that happened, her people would defend themselves again. The cycle would continue until one species or the other was gone. I understood. I released the connection and nodded to James. He opened the sling. She slipped into the water with barely a splash, her gray form disappearing into the blue darkness within seconds. We watched the water for a long time, but she didn't resurface. She was gone, returned to her people, safe for now. "Did we do the right thing?" Tom asked quietly. "I don't know," I said. "But it's done." We spent the rest of that day collecting our equipment, retrieving the cameras, dismantling the bait stations. Nina recorded everything with narration about predator investigation and inconclusive results. We were building the official story, the version that would go into reports and databases: large predator, territorial behavior, recommended closure, clean, scientific, deliberately vague. At 2 p.m., something appeared in the water near the boat, a shell, large and perfect, floating on the surface, then another, then a third. They drifted toward us on a current that should have been moving the opposite direction. Sarah pulled them aboard with a net. Inside each shell was a black pearl, perfectly round, obviously placed there intentionally. "They're thanking us," James said. Robert nodded. "Or paying us for her safe return. Either way, it's an acknowledgement. They know what we did." I kept one pearl, gave one each to Sarah and Tom. Nina refused hers, saying it felt like taking payment for doing the bare minimum of decency. Robert and James kept theirs, but Robert later told me he'd leave his at a traditional site as an offering, maintaining the old agreements his grandmother had taught him about. We reached Cairns Harbor on April 9th. I filed my report that afternoon. Evidence of large predator exhibiting territorial behavior, insufficient data to identify species, recommendation for indefinite closure of affected area to night diving operations. The EMSA accepted the report with obvious disappointment. They'd wanted answers, wanted closure for the families, wanted something concrete to justify the investigation costs. What they got was a vague predator warning and a recommendation to close prime diving territory. But they implemented it anyway, because 14 deaths demanded some response, and closing the area was better than admitting they had no idea what had really happened. The families never got real closure. The official line was that the divers had encountered an unknown marine predator, possibly a large shark or ray exhibiting atypical behavior. Some accepted this. Others hired private investigators, demanded more research, refused to believe their loved ones had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. I never told them the truth. How could I? Your husband died defending someone else's nursery. Your daughter was killed protecting breeding grounds. Your son was a casualty in a territorial dispute he didn't even know he was part of. The truth wouldn't have brought comfort. It would have brought more questions, more boats, more intrusion into waters that were already battlegrounds. Our research team disbanded within 2 months. Sarah took a position in the Caribbean studying reef restoration. Tom finished his PhD and moved into aquaculture research, deliberately choosing work that kept him away from wild ocean environments. Nina's documentary was never completed. She sold the remaining footage to a nature program that edited it into something unrecognizable. James and Robert went back to their work as dive instructors, but they never took groups to that section of reef again. They found reasons to avoid it, redirected tourist requests to other sites, quietly maintained the boundaries their grandmothers had taught them to respect, and I kept the secret. For 23 years, I kept the secret. The nightmares started about 6 months after we returned. Not every night, but often enough. I'd dream I was back in the water, descending into the caves where her people lived. In the dreams, I could breathe underwater. I could see in the darkness, and I could see the divers' bodies preserved and arranged with care, their eyes open and staring. I'd wake up gasping, guilty for reasons I couldn't fully articulate. We'd done the right thing by releasing her. We'd protected a species from exploitation and probable extinction, but 14 people were still dead, and their families still had no real answers. That weight never got lighter. I stayed in marine biology but shifted my focus. I spent the next 2 decades studying human impact on ocean ecosystems, publishing papers about habitat destruction, territorial displacement of marine species, the cumulative effects of tourism on reef health. Everything I wrote was informed by what I'd learned in 2002, but I could never cite the real source. I wrote around the truth, pointing at patterns without naming the species at the center of them. In 2008, 6 years after the incident, there was another disappearance near Flynn Reef. A solo diver, night dive, vanished without trace. The investigation was brief. The area was still under restricted access, and the diver had violated the closure. The official conclusion was that he'd ignored safety protocols and paid the price. I knew better. Someone had pushed into their territory again, and they'd defended it again. I thought about reaching out, about trying to prevent future incidents, but what could I do? I couldn't reveal the truth without exposing the species. The best I could manage was publishing another paper about the importance of respecting marine protected areas and the ecological reasons for maintaining closures even when the immediate threat seems to have passed. In 2015, I returned to cairns for the first time since 2002. I didn't plan to go near the reef, but I met with Robert at a cafe in town. He was 58 then, still teaching diving, but mostly to beginners in shallow water. James had died 3 years earlier, cancer, and Robert carried a loneliness that reminded me of my own. "You ever think about her?" Robert asked. We'd never discussed it directly since leaving the boat, but we both knew what he meant. Every day, I said. My grandmother died in 2010, Robert said. Before she went, she told me something. She said, the Yok-Yok used to help our people sometimes. If someone was drowning, if children got caught in currents, they'd bring them back to shore. She said that stopped around the 1950s, when the boats got bigger and the fishing got worse. They stopped trusting us. Can you blame them? No, Robert said. But I wonder sometimes if we could have had something different. If we'd listened to the old stories, if we'd respected the boundaries, maybe we could have coexisted. Maybe they wouldn't have had to hide. I thought about that. Conversation for years afterward. The possibility of coexistence, of mutual respect between species, felt like something from a better timeline than ours. In our world, discovery meant exploitation. Contact meant colonization. We couldn't even coexist peacefully with other human cultures, let alone an entirely different intelligent species. The closure remained in effect through 2020, though I knew from monitoring reports that it was under increasing pressure from tourism operators. The economic argument was simple. 40 miles of healthy reef sitting unused while dive companies competed for access to increasingly crowded alternative sites. There were petitions, lobbying efforts, arguments that enough time had passed that whatever predator had been responsible was likely dead or moved on. I submitted testimony every time the closure came up for review. I cited ecological precautionary principles, potential breeding grounds for endangered species, the need for reference areas untouched by human activity. I never mentioned the real reason, but I fought hard to maintain that protected space. In 2023, the closure was finally reduced, not eliminated, but reduced to a 15-mile stretch around the original disappearance sites. The other 25 miles were reopened to regulated diving. I watched the news with a sense of dread, waiting for the inevitable. The first disappearance in the newly reopened area happened in October 2023. A night dive, an experienced diver, vanished without trace. The investigation went nowhere. Most people assumed it was another shark attack, tragic but not unprecedented. The area remained open. I knew better. The war had resumed, and this time I couldn't stop it with a research report and a species protection argument. The economic pressure was too strong. The tourism industry had waited 21 years. They weren't going to close the reef again without definitive proof of danger. That's when I started writing this account. Not for publication initially, just to document what really happened, to have a record that existed somewhere besides my failing memory. I'm 58 now. I won't live forever. Someone should know the truth, even if that truth can't be acted on. I wrote for myself at first. Then I kept writing because I realized silence had its own cost. 14 families in 2002 never got real closure. More families since then. They deserved to know their loved ones hadn't died for nothing, hadn't just been random victims of nature's cruelty. They'd died because we pushed into territory that wasn't ours, ignored warnings we didn't recognize, and chose exploitation over coexistence. But I also knew that publishing this truth would doom the species I'd spent 23 years protecting. If people knew intelligent beings were defending those reefs, the response wouldn't be respect or reconciliation. It would be elimination. Her people would be classified as dangerous, as threats to human activity. There would be hunts, extermination efforts, maybe capture and study in facilities where they'd live out their lives in tanks like the one I'd kept her in for 3 days. So I wrote this account and sat on it. For 2 more years, I wrote and revised and debated whether the world deserved this truth or whether some truths are too dangerous to tell. I'm still not certain I've made the right choice by finally deciding to release it. Last month, I received an email from a documentary filmmaker working on a project about the 2002 disappearances. She'd found my name in the old investigation files and wanted to interview me about the research expedition. She had questions about the predator theory, about why the area was closed for so long, about whether I thought it was safe to dive there now. Her email included a detail that made my hands shake. She was planning to film at Flynn Reef, including night dives in the formerly restricted zone. She wanted to prove that whatever had been there in 2002 was gone now, that the closure had been overly cautious. She saw it as an opportunity to restore access to pristine diving sites that had been protected from human impact for 2 decades. I called her immediately, told her not to film there, that the danger was still present, that some closures exist for reasons beyond what official reports contain. She thanked me politely and ignored everything I said. In her mind, I was an aging scientist clinging to outdated caution. She had funding, permits, and a crew. The filming was scheduled for next month. That's why I'm releasing this account now, because my silence, which was meant to protect her people, has become a liability. Without the truth, without understanding what's really in those waters, people like this filmmaker will keep pushing deeper. They'll keep ignoring warnings. They'll keep dying, and her people will keep defending their territory. And eventually, someone will capture or kill one of them, and the truth will come out anyway, probably in the worst possible way. At least this way, the truth comes with context, with explanation, with a chance for people to understand that the creatures in those waters aren't monsters. They're people defending their homes from invaders who don't even realize they're invading. I don't expect this account to change anything immediately. Most readers will dismiss it as fiction, as a creative writing exercise, as the confused memories of an old man who spent too much time alone in the ocean. The ones who believe it will probably think I'm calling for protection, for study, for managed contact with this newly revealed species. I'm not. I'm calling for the opposite. I'm asking people to leave them alone, to respect the closures that still exist, to push for expanding protected areas rather than reducing them, to accept that not every part of the ocean belongs to us just because we have the technology to reach it. The pearl Robert gave me sits on my desk as I write this. I've kept it for 23 years, a reminder of the agreement we made that day. We release her, we protect her people's secret, and in return, they spare us. It's a fragile agreement, constantly tested by people who don't know it exists. This account will probably end that agreement. Her people will know I've told the truth. They might see it as a betrayal. But I hope, they'll understand that I'm trying to prevent something worse. I'm trying to give the world enough context to make better choices, to recognize warnings, to understand that disappearances in certain waters aren't mysteries or tragedies or random acts of nature, they're consequences. To the filmmaker planning to dive at Flynn Reef, don't. I know you won't listen. People never do. But when you descend into those waters with your lights and cameras, when you push into the caves looking for dramatic footage, remember that you're not exploring empty wilderness. You're entering someone's home, and they will defend it. To her people, if you're somehow able to read or understand this, I'm sorry. I kept your secret for 23 years, but silence wasn't working anymore. People kept coming, they'll keep coming. Maybe the truth will make them more careful. Maybe it won't. But I've run out of ways to protect you without telling them why you need protecting. To the families who lost someone in those waters, I'm sorry I couldn't tell you this sooner. Your loved ones died because we, as a species, don't respect boundaries we don't understand. They weren't killed by mindless predators. They were casualties in a conflict between intelligent species competing for space in an ocean we assume belongs entirely to us. That doesn't make the loss easier, but maybe it makes it make sense. I'm 58 years old. I've been keeping this secret for 23 years. And now, it's not a secret anymore. I don't know what happens next. I don't know if this account will change anything, or if it will just add another layer of controversy to a story that's already too complicated for simple answers. What I know is this: there are people in the ocean. They've been there longer than we've been diving it. They're not going to leave. And every time we push into their territory with our boats and our lights, and our assumption that everything is ours to explore, we're making a choice. We're choosing conflict over coexistence. We're choosing convenience over respect. The question isn't whether they'll keep defending their territory. They will. The question is whether we're capable of recognizing that defense as legitimate, as the same thing any intelligent species would do when their homes are invaded, or whether we'll keep calling them monsters right up until we've pushed them into extinction. I don't have an answer to that question. I just know that after 23 years of silence, I had to tell someone the truth, even if the truth doesn't change anything, even if it makes things worse. She looked at me with those black eyes and showed me a world where her people lived in peace before we came with our technology and our entitlement. I owe it to her to at least try to show our world what we're destroying, even if we're too arrogant to care.